welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Ia Darris
Hey.
and Sam Spieler.
Hello.
Today, we are continuing our series on campus novels with a discussion of John Williams' Stoner. As a reminder, you can join our extended discussion on Reddit at Canonical Pod. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod, all one word. We will be revealing spoilers here, so if you don't want the ending spoiled for you, check out our review, which we published last week. All right, let's dive right in.
I think that the thing that everybody who comes to Stoner knows about this book is that it was published in 1965 and very quickly forgotten and then rediscovered later on. Julian Barnes, the English novelist, was writing about the novel in The Guardian, and he noted that the renaissance of this novel has been a mostly European phenomenon. What I'm wondering about is whether there is something about William Stoner, the character, that's distinctly un-American, or that makes him unappealing to American readers. In that same article in The Guardian, an American novelist, Sylvia Brownrigg, responded, "The reticence seems very not American to me. In spite of the American setting, the character himself feels more English or European. Opaque, fundamentally decent and passive. Perhaps the lack of the novels taking hold in the US is because it doesn't feel like one of ours. We're such a country of maximalists, noisy ones, and though obviously there are exceptions, even our minimalists are not spare and sad in this particular way." Is Brownrigg on the nose here, or is there something missing from her analysis?
I want to disagree, but I feel like my disagreeing feeds into her argument.
What do you mean?
I feel like we are not all the same, obviously, but my speaking against that is a very un-Stoner thing. So I feel like that kind of proves her point.
What do you think she means by maximalist?
Living life in such a way that all of your thoughts and feelings are expressed and all of your ambitions are attempted, even if they fail. You make motions towards whatever you want out of life.
There's an obviousness to action and reaction.
Right. I guess I'm asking that because there's actually a literary term, maximalism. That's the polar opposite of minimalism as a style. So when she says maximalists, it makes me wonder, like, what exactly is she talking about? So in this context, is what she's saying that we are people who are aware of our own agency and we tend to seize it, whereas Europeans are not? Is that what she's saying?
I would say yes.
I think it's more than that. The impression I get, it's that, but it's also that we are loud and vociferous of what we are doing or what we want, rather than this internal quiet.
I agree. I think that there is a value in restraint that might be in the European psyche that is absent from the American psyche in some cases.
I can see that, but at the same time, I think this kind of subject matter is really similar to Carver's subject matter, Raymond Carver. And there are other writers who write in the same vein.
Subject matter, but not characterization.
Is the character of William Stoner different from most Americans that you know? I guess would be a better way to ask the question.
I would still say the same thing. I think the characters that are in Stoner, specifically Stoner, is not that different from the characters that are in Carver, especially his early work. I don't think it's that different. You have people who are, sure, they're maybe of a different class, but they are largely impotent and they don't necessarily voice, or they are not necessarily capable of voicing their displeasures, and they're not capable of taking action. And Carver was widely celebrated in the literary world here, and he was widely appreciated worldwide as well. I don't know. I don't think I can describe it to merely that.
I think I agree with her. There is a sense that he is an un-American character in a certain limited sense, but I also find Stoner to be an example of that sort of Protestant work ethic, American Gothic sort of Midwestern sensibility. He comes from very humble farming stock. He's not a pretentious person, but he's also not an ascetic, you know? He does in the novel willingly give himself over to the pleasures of literature. He gives himself over to his relationship with his daughter and the pleasure that he gets from that. And he also finds pleasure in his relationship with Catherine later in the novel. So I don't think it's fair to say that he's an austere person, but he's not a sensualist, you know, he doesn't indulge himself. I think the reason why the readers in the 60s weren't receptive to Stoner is that as a character, he's more out of time than out of place. I think when we think of 1965, when the novel was published, what we remember is an increasing liberalism and openness in American society. It spread throughout not just the literary world, but all of society. And Stoner stands in sharp contrast to that because we see his stoic restraint. And I think from the outside, a lot of people would confuse that restraint with conservatism. I think he might look like a conservative to certain readers, but he's not one. He has the sense of propriety, which is different from Edith because it's based not on received wisdom, but it's also not based on personal feelings like Lomax. Lomax, I think, has the same relationship with art that Stoner has, but he's much more of a romantic in that he's caught up in the emotion of literature. I think with Stoner himself, he seems very stoic because his understanding of the world comes indirectly through regular contact with works of art.
I agree with everything you said, except the premise, I guess. I think the objection isn't the character so much as the style that it's written in. It's not the stoicism of the character that people probably didn't like, but the stoicism of the writing, the plainness of the style.
First of all, there is a restraint in a novel. Why does the restraint that we find in Stoner turn some people off, but the restraint that we find in other plainly or minimally written fiction doesn't turn people off? But the first question, the primary question is, why would you say it's the style that turns people off rather than the character? In last week's episode, when James was talking about not enjoying the novel, it seemed to me that James's reaction was that he didn't like the character.
I was frustrated with the character, but I didn't hate him. I wasn't turned off from the novel because of the character.
I think for me, the difficulty is I'm trying to compare this book to other quiet books, like, for example, Olive Kitteridge or other Midwestern writers. I'm thinking of someone like one of my favorites, Marilyn Robinson in Housekeeping, which is a very quiet book. And all of her books are really quiet. And what seems to be lacking, I think, is, or a key difference, is not necessarily the character, because this kind of character of Stoner, this kind of a reticent actor, a largely passive character, someone who endures, that's not uncommon in literature. That's quite common in literature, especially literature written by people in the Midwest. But I think a key difference for me is this is a constant downward slope with an uptick at the end. And these other writers have a tendency to kind of mix in moments of grace. And it's not they're not moments of levity, but they're moments of redemption that kind of build. So it's a different kind of slope, if that makes sense. What makes this novel difficult is it's this constant downward slope, and it's a little bit like striking that same note again and again, which is not a problem. It's just a certain kind of novel, a certain kind of story. So I wouldn't necessarily ascribe it to the character. I would ascribe it to the kind of theme that he is presenting here. It's a theme that is very difficult to grapple with. Like you mentioned, it's something that not everyone would appreciate. But other ideas presented by other writers with a similar character, they're more accessible. And I think that makes it more popular.
So just to be sure I understand clearly, would you say then that the reason why this novel was forgotten very quickly was because it's too bleak?
Yeah, and it kind of goes to your comment. You said at that time period, it's not exactly what people were looking for. And so much appreciation of a work is as a result of the time period in which it's published. Maybe at this time, people in Europe are more ready to accept this kind of novel. And so it's garnered an audience. I can't say because I haven't lived in Europe or the UK or whatever country this novel is very popular in at this moment. But I would be very hesitant to say that it is because this character is more European than American.
This bleakness that you're talking about, do you think it's because of the things that happen to him in the novel, which we can say are out of his control? Or is it the things that he can control that create the sense of bleakness? Is it his reaction or lack of reaction?
Well, it's both. It's all the events in his life are negative, with the exception of Catherine. And even then, he loses Catherine, but he has that positive in the interlude. And also his reaction is largely passive. So it's both. A comparison I think is worthwhile is someone like Tawada. You know, we all loved The Emissary. Tawada is, I believe, very popular in Europe. And you can see how in that book, the main character, Yoshiro, is a similar kind of character. He's quite passive, right? But you can see how, like, even though he's a similar kind of character, the way it's written is full of grace. It kind of elevates you. For me, that is the key difference. I don't think it's the character that makes the book more or less popular. It's the treatment of that character, how the author approaches the character and portrays him.
It does feel like John Williams would have not liked Tawada and her style.
Yes, and this kind of goes to my question. I think he would have detested that book, but I think that the two characters are actually quite similar in that they both endure. That's the defining grace of Yoshiro, is he's a survivor. And then we play that clip.
Beyonce?
Yeah.
Got it.
Well, I suppose it's just a matter of sensibility on the part of the reader, and perhaps I have more of a taste for bitterness than either of you two. Because, well, I do agree that it is a bleak novel, and you do see him suffering and enduring. I found that the redemption that we found at the end of the novel was so substantial that it validated all of the previous suffering. Now that we're outside of the spoiler territory, I think the thing to focus on is the final scene in the novel when he's lying on his deathbed and he's slowly wasting away. And he sees things. And the first thing I remember he sees in front of him, he sees Edith's face and she's caring for him. And he thinks to himself something like, well, she's got another child to take care of now. She's happy. And then the refrain is, what did you expect? And then later on, he hears a group of young people outside, young men and women out on a date together. And the men are smiling very happily at the women. And he thinks to himself, well, what did you expect? And then finally, he looks at his book that he wrote, his one great artistic or scholarly achievement, and then he finally dies. And that, to me, I think it redeems the entire novel. I think that that scene at the end of the novel is so powerful and so moving that it does all of the work that you would find in other novels where you would see these moments of grace or these moments of at least pleasantness. I think it does a lot of work. And I think that that final scene is really crucial. It's an epiphany of sorts.
I understand, and I think I agree with you that it does provide this sense of relief at the end. But that still, his characterization is not what I had the biggest problem with. It's the style that everything was written in. It's the stoicism of the writing, not the stoicism of the character. Kind of to James's point about Yoshiro, while those are two very different books, that was a much more pleasurable read.
Well, kind of what you're talking about, Sam, it leads to a New Yorker article titled John Williams and the Canon That Might Have Been. Critic Leo Robeson details a war waged by 20th century critic Ivor Winters against the imitative form, which was popularized by modernists and postmodernists in favor of a more traditional composition, that he says, quote, has a sense of rational order in the plain style. Winters argues that the sound alternative was to make a lucid statement regarding the condition of uncertainty, and the conscious author, in the pursuit of formal perfection, emerged as a desirable alternative to the fragmentary, once again his words, fragmentary and unguided thought of the character as he walks down the street, or sits in a bar, or dreams at night. So he's kind of arguing against, for example, Ulysses, or any kind of stream of consciousness novel, or any novel that has a very loose form. He's a poet that started as a modernist poet, but then returned to more formalist styles of poetry with stanzas and rhymes and such. So I agree in that the traditional form, as he describes, and the traditional form is what Stoner is written in, has a place in literature, and that it's underappreciated of late. I don't think I agree, and I can't go so far to say that the experimental forms are lesser in some way. Do you think that there's any merit to this argument nowadays? This argument for formalism in literature? Or has this argument already been resolved? Is there a merit for this argument that formalism is superior, that it's desirable, it's what writers should try to achieve?
I think that's kind of a ridiculous and very puffy argument to say that one form of literature, one writer's style, is superior to another, especially when you take into account how popularity is a bad measure of greatness, I suppose. But the ability of something to speak to people, I think, is something worth talking about and worth thinking about in terms of greatness or lack thereof. In that article, Leo Robson mentions Saul Bellows' novel Herzog that came out the exact same year, 1965, that is very similar in theme. All of the big hallmarks that take place in Stoner take place in Herzog. The characters are very similar. Their lives are very similar. But Saul Bellows' treatment of the characters are completely different. And it made me really interested in reading Herzog because I have a feeling I would enjoy that a lot more. And I think that makes me a bit populist in my tastes, but I don't think that's lesser in this case.
I think if we want to zero in specifically on what Winters is talking about against this imitative form, is the idea that the style of a text can inform the reader's reception to the text. And it's clear that readers can enjoy a text because of its style, but if the goal of a text is to have a certain reaction or a certain reception from the reader, then that needs to be defined in advance. And I think that one of the goals, not to say that this is a superior goal of literature, is to show the reader an authentic human subject and to show the reader how to live and how to find meaning in life and how to make the most of the situation that we're in. And that's exactly what I find in Stoner. And this comparison that James has been making to The Emissary and the character of Yoshiro, to me, is way out of left field because that text is completely different. Its goals are completely different from Stoner. In that text, it's everything about the pleasure of language and the pleasure of these run-on sentences and ideas shifting and mutating. It has nothing to do with how to live a satisfying life. And I think that if the goal of literature is that, then Stoner is a failure. But if the goal of literature is for a reader to understand a human experience and perhaps learn from it, then I don't see anything that this imitative style can add to Stoner that would satisfy the achievement of that goal.
I guess that makes sense. I feel like Williams' treatment of Stoner and his success in doing so is the reason why it was shelved for so long, though. I feel like because he was so precise and plain in his treatment, that's why it didn't sit well with writers or readers for such a long time. I don't know why now. I don't know why, if it just took a few champions to really push it, but I understand why it was shelved for so long.
Well, my question then is, John Williams was a very strident admirer of Winters, and you can see these arguments play out in his book, especially with Walker, who is more of a romantic. He kind of shoots from the hip. He doesn't really take the requisite steps. He doesn't know the basics about English literature. He goes by his feeling. And in this character, it's kind of a skewering of this other mode of writing. Do you think that to really fully appreciate the book, you kind of have to subscribe to this idea of formalism? Because I would argue then, if you know this background about the writer, that this is actually a very key part of the book, this kind of advocacy of formalism. Do you think you need to be sympathetic to this kind of argument in order to fully appreciate the book?
I would say no. I would say knowing about this enriches your reading of the novel and it makes it more worth academic study. But even the reader who has no clue about those things would still be able to enjoy the novel. And I think that the reason why it's not important is, like I said, the issue is whether or not the style gains you greater access to the human condition and the human experience that Stoner is having in this novel. And for me, I think that having a more romantic approach, a greater fixation on the lived experience of Stoner, would detract from that. I think that the way that the style is handled gets me more direct access to the experience and also more direct access to the theme. As I mentioned in the previous episode, I think the elucidation of the theme is very, very well handled, and it gets directly at the key issue of the novel.
Do you think that the human experience is best explored through this kind of style? Can experimental forms also explore the human condition?
I think they can. I don't want to rule anything out without really considering it, but I do think that in a novel like Stoner, there is a sense that Williams is guiding you by the hand and showing you the most salient features of a life and saying, this is the moment when this happened to Stoner, and I want to pause here and focus on it because this is important. It was clear to me when I was reading the novel that a lot of his life was cut out. Like there would be passages where he would say, and the next 3 years passed uneventfully. And then we come back into close focus and we see a scene of Stoner and Edith doing something together. And then we zoom back out again. So we are seeing Stoner, but we're being guided through Stoner's life by Williams. And I think that that kind of hand-holding is really helpful. If the point of the author is to show you something specific, why not hold the reader's hand? And if the point of the writer is not to show you something specific, but to take you on this roller coaster ride like Tawada, then don't hold hands. It's fine. But you have to decide what you want to do from the outset.
I think where I disagree is, and I might be presuming here, but it sounds like you're saying experimental forms cannot achieve this aim as well. And that's, I think, where I would disagree. I think that experimental forms can achieve the aim of depicting the human condition just as well as this very tightly structured kind of formalist way of writing a novel.
I agree with both of you, but I wanted to focus on something Iad pointed out. One of the things that I agree with is how you don't have to have that special knowledge of Williams's taste for formalism and distaste for romanticism in order to appreciate these points. But knowing that does detract from the story for me. Knowing that maybe Walker is this personification of this newer, less traditional romantic style, it makes me roll my eyes. It makes me take it less seriously because it makes it sound like it is an argument against this style, not just saying I don't like this, but that this is inferior to my style.
I think you're right. Walker is being used as a caricature of a certain sort of literary appreciator. But at the same time, I think that this aspect of Stoner requires a reader to have an opinion. And I think it's an opinion that I don't fully have yet. And I think perhaps you also don't have it yet, which is the ultimate or most important purpose of literature. And I think that John Williams does have an opinion and Winters does have an opinion. And I think for them, their opinion is that literature shows you something about life and something about being human. And other writers have different opinions, and other writers might say that the literary object is its own thing, separate from our lives, and we can enjoy it and appreciate it on an aesthetic level, disconnected from our own experience as human beings. And that's absolutely a valid reaction, but it's a different reaction, and I don't think we have the appropriate time to decide right now between which one we prefer, or even if we have to decide. But I think the point is that Williams has decided, and we can't begrudge him his decision.
No, we can't. But John Williams did say something about his co-winner of the National Book Award. He won the National Book Award for Augustus, and he shared that award that year with John Barth.
Oh, yeah. What a pairing.
Yeah. And he said something to the effect, or it was intimated, that he felt John Barth's style and this more experimental style was a dead end. And I think time proved him wrong. Literature, as we see it today, has proved him wrong.
I mean, these are very basic and big and fundamental questions. And I think that we're not wrong to have not solved them here, because I think there are lots of people who love literature that haven't made these decisions. For me, the jury is still out about whether Williams was actually wrong. I actually am a much greater fan of postmodern fiction than I am of this plain style that Williams specializes in. But at the same time, I'm willing to withhold judgment on whether or not one is superior to the other. But I do think that if you care a lot, at some point, if you're willing to spend the time thinking about it, you can't just say, well, everything is equally good. You have to make a decision.
I suppose so, but that's also a very subjective decision. There is objectivity to that, but I think the reader has to decide that for themselves, too. John Williams even said, I write for the reader more than I write for myself. The reader deserves some respect and consideration. We're arrogant about this, and people are more intelligent than we think they are. I think he's right, but I think he's wrong in his approach. He kind of proves himself, but in the opposite way. I don't think the simple act of writing in this traditional, quote-unquote, traditionalist form is more rewarding to the reader necessarily, or less.
I think the legacy of this tiff is that nowadays, 50 plus years later, you have writers who are inheritors of both traditions. At that time, you have people like Williams and Winters saying, what you're writing is honestly crap. And you have the experimental writers saying, what you're doing is old-fashioned, boring, this is the future. And I think what the future actually became is a blending of both, because young writers learn how to write in this kind of traditional style. These kinds of novels are taught to young writers, but at the same time, writing in an experimental way is way more accepted now. And it's kind of like you have the option to choose which direction you want to go. I think that is the legacy of this argument, is that in some ways Williams and Winters lost because they're saying it has to be this way. But they're wrong because it doesn't have to be this way.
It's kind of like you have to learn the basics of grammar and construction of a sentence before you can break those rules. So I understand that traditionalist and the need for that style, but I think it's totally acceptable and even wonderful for that style to be broken down.
I have to disagree. It sounds like what you're saying is that the current fashion for experimental forms validates the existence of experimental forms. But that to me is just like saying, well, the fact that we've already taken a left turn shows that the left turn was the right turn to make. Like, yeah, we could have done this, but that doesn't mean that we did the right thing. And again, just to be clear, I'm actually a great fan of postmodern fiction. I don't share William's sentiment, but I don't think that your argument against William's sentiment is as convincing as it might seem.
I think it depends on, if he says that's a dead end, I guess you have to say, well, there's no way to disprove it, because if your timeline is a millennium, then yes, like obviously it's not a dead end yet. It can't be proven. But if your time period is shorter, let's say 50 years, then you have to say, well, it's not a dead end because people are obviously still very much discussing this more experimental style and implementing it and using it. What's interesting also is in this article, Robeson gives a counterfactual. I mean, he asks the question, what would the canon be if you picked writers in that tradition? And he has a list of writers that are definitely not as famous as Barth. And of course, fame is not the decider here. But I think what is important is that this is what people are reading now and what people are deeming worthwhile of study or discussion. So the claim that whatever these writers are writing is a dead end, it's proven to not be true thus far. So I'm fairly comfortable in saying that I don't think they're winning this argument.
So we've talked a lot today about how John Williams' style is very plain and straightforward. In Dan Wakefield's essay, John Williams, Plain Writer, Williams says in an interview portion that the impetus for this book came from his regarding of a teacher at his University of Missouri who flunked him, which I suppose makes Williams the Charles Walker of his own life, briefly. And he wondered, what does it mean to be a teacher? And I'm wondering, does that question get answered here? The genesis does not mean that he set out to answer it in this book, but what can you see here about the heroism of being a teacher not interested in fame or success?
I think it's not that he's uninterested in fame or success, it's that he's not successful. Even though he wants to be a good teacher, he doesn't always succeed. And I think the fact that he doesn't succeed is meaningful because I think that the kind of cliche or trite sentiment is that if you just do your best is good enough. But I think what happens in Stoner, the reason why readers like you might find it bleak is that he's trying his best and it's not good enough. And I think for me, one of the big messages is that when you try your best and your best isn't good enough, that's still okay. And I think that that message holds true for teaching and everything else.
For me, the role of the teacher, and I really liked this, I read it in a review, someone described the character as being a kind of steward or a monk in a monastery. This is a book about the life of the mind, and the role of the teacher is the steward in that life. His role is to ensure that knowledge is held in high regard and exalted and passed on. And for me, that's what this role of, quote, teacher does in the novel. That's the heroism that I see. It has nothing to do with fame or success at all, I think. Because it says at his retirement dinner, right, he says, thank you for giving me the opportunity to teach. I mean, that's crucial, right? Because it's the act of teaching that is important. It's not any recognition that comes from it.
So is this just about dedication? Is dedication the most important part? Not did you impart the knowledge that you intended to? Not did you spark interest in some minds? Did you actually convey something meaningful? But just the intention, just the dedication to teaching, regardless of how well you did it. Is that all that matters?
No, I don't think it's that at all, because he talks about why he needs to defend academia from Walker. And to me, Walker is symbolic of someone who cannot teach. he doesn't know the basics that is required of a teacher. I mean, once again, he's exalting this position of academic stroke teacher. Walker cannot be accepted because Walker does not understand the very basic requirements of being the steward. So I think there is such a thing as a bad teacher, and I don't think there's any indication that he's not a good teacher, even though it does say in the book that there are times when he didn't try as hard. But I think the key takeaway for me is that he is wholly dedicated to this life of the mind. That's what's important. Whereas Walker is not dedicated to the life of the mind. He's dedicated to being a bullshit artist.
Yeah, there is proof in that with Dave Masters is held up in this very high regard, so much so that Stoner, looks to Lomax as maybe being the new Masters in his life. He sees something in Lomax as another steward, another person who can shield the university from the outside world. And I guess that sets up that tension between him and Lomax, and between Lomax and Walker against Stoner.
For me, I think the key thing with regard to the theme of academia in the novel is that Stoner has a conception of his vocation which is not really based in the world at all. He's an idealist, but he never satisfies his own ideal, but he's frustrated with himself and also frustrated with other people for not satisfying the ideal. It points back to a pivotal scene in the beginning of the novel when Finch and Stoner and Masters are drinking beer, and Masters is giving his sermon about all of their characters. And he says to Stoner, he says, "You too are cut out for failure. Not that you'd fight the world. You'd let it chew you up and spit you out, and you'd lie there wondering what was wrong. Because you'd always expect the world to be something it wasn't, something it had no wish to be." And I think that this really hits a nerve with Stoner when he's a young scholar. It's a very insightful comment that Stoner isn't ready to hear. But I think that Stoner, he has an idea of what a teacher should be. I don't think he ever reaches his own goal, but he's also very protective of the role, and he's very critical of people who also fail to achieve that goal.
I think the reason why I really like and I wish I could remember which reviewer said this, that likened academia in this book to a monastery, and that he was a monk, likened Stoner to a monk. Well, the reason why I really like it is, as a monk, you can't ever achieve what you're striving to achieve. You can't ascend because you're still alive. You can only go through the daily routines. You can only make motions toward what you're trying to do. But I don't think there's such a thing as a perfect monk, whereas there is such a thing as a perfect novel. But as a perfect monk, you can't ever achieve it until you die. And really your goal is to uphold. So my reading of the book is a little bit different from yours, Ed, because for me, that is what the book is about the life of the mind, and is about being a servant to that life.
Not to deflate the entire conversation about his role as a teacher, but I would like to say that his role as a teacher is important to the novel, but it's not the most important thing in the novel. I think the real testament to how great this novel is, at least in my opinion, is that it totally does everything that you wanted to do with this academic theme, but it does so in passing. It does so in passing as it moves towards the higher theme that I mentioned in the previous episode of how to live a meaningful life without success, without the overt signs of success, and to live with dignity. And I think why this work is so regarded is because it can do both of those things simultaneously, but do both of them well at the exact same time, which is incredibly difficult to do. So if somebody came to me and he told me about this novel and he said, well, this is a novel about a teacher, a college teacher who struggles with what it means to be a teacher, and that's all he said to me about the novel, I would say, man, you really need to read that novel again because you missed some of the most important things. Like, to me, teaching is not the important thing. There was a a line in the Julian Barnes piece in The Guardian where he says Stoner is a campus novel, but it's not really a campus novel. And his previous novel, Butcher's Crossing, is a Western, but it's not really a Western. And his later novel, Augustus, is a Roman novel, but it's not really a Roman novel. Like, he's always bursting at the seams. There is no particular genre that contains him.
Well, this conversation is bursting at the seams, so let's take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about whether or not the book world is fair. Welcome back. So, people, not a lot, but at the time, some people loved this book, and then it was forgotten. Is the book world a meritocracy?
Clearly, no. I think it's not, but
What idiot would ask this question?
I think it's a question worth asking because when we do see some very famous novels and we read them and we love them, we say, well, clearly there's some mechanism in the book world that allows good books to rise to the top, right?
This is an interesting case because I don't think his publisher was wrong. I read a lot of things that said his editors and publisher argued with him about things he did in the novel, treatments of Stoner and treatments of his wife, Edith. And he appeased some of them and ignored others. And I forget the name of his publisher, but told her, don't worry about it. This will find its time, and it's probably not going to be a bestseller, but it is a great novel, and it will find its audience. I think that's pretty interesting that it did many, many years later, but as we've talked about, in a very strange, roundabout sort of way. Again, I don't think his publisher was wrong, but it's just as interesting that he was right.
It's a difficult question because there are a lot of attendant questions, one being what constitutes a success, and another being how do you judge a book, right? These are questions that we are always talking about. Like if you say a book is successful when it is canonized, when people read it, then that's one thing. But if you say a book is successful because it sells well, that's an entirely different thing. So in this case, I think we're talking about appreciation, not necessarily sales. Is that right?
Well, kind of both. What I was saying about his publisher being right is that his publisher was probably more worried about those sales, but he was more worried about how it was going to be regarded.
Yeah, but that guy's a bum. Who cares about his publisher? He's not the genius we're talking about here that Yed extols.
In one sense, sales matter just because a book has got to be sold in order to be read. If nobody buys the book, nobody's going to care about it, right?
And to my second point, I think you can certainly look at a book holistically and say whether or not it's good or bad. But for me, I feel much more comfortable talking about books from different approaches. So, for example, technically, this book is very proficient. It's written incredibly well. And I think a lot of books are written incredibly well, but they don't do well. And they don't do well because it's not the right time for the book. People don't care about whatever the book's talking about. Or maybe the book is talking about nothing at all. It's just technically well written, but it has no ideas present. And because of that, the book is a flop. There are lots of ways for a book to be well done, but for it to not merit success, if that makes sense. On the other hand, you might have a book that's very socially relevant, but maybe technically it's weak. That book can be successful. And I don't think it's unfair to say, well, because that book is technically weak, we should not appreciate it. I think that's a bit unfair because perhaps the cultural impact of the book is important. And this is where I actually was with a book like There, or to a lesser extent, Britt Bennett's book, The Vanishing Half. I don't think we would say that those books are as technically proficient as this book, But I think we would say for this time period, those books are incredibly important. So it's entirely different. Like I wouldn't say because those books are not technically proficient, they should not be appreciated and they shouldn't be bought and that everyone should buy this book instead.
I guess you'd have to wonder then if it's really the writer's duty to gauge the spirit of his times and to respond accordingly. Or if you can say that Williams was within his rights as an author to say, well, I don't care about 1965. I'm going to publish this novel now, and eventually, 30 years down the road, it'll find an audience. I think that responding to the times that you live in is a skill like any others. And if a writer has that skill, he's deserving of praise. And if he lacks that skill, he's deserving of criticism. But at the same time, if you decide willingly, you know it's not going to fit in the spirit of the times, and you decide willingly to go ahead regardless, it's not a fault of craft, it's a fault of judgment, I would say. You know that what you're doing is not going to be successful, and you choose to do it regardless.
Kind of an entrepreneurial style versus one of pure craft. Believing in oneself and one's purity, I guess, rather than how well they think something will do in the current era.
All right. Well, we'll have to once again cut our conversation short. There's so much more to talk about, and we will continue our discussion on Reddit, which includes Showalter's criticism of the women and the disabled in the novel. So let's conclude here. Thank you for listening. You will find our reading schedule once again on Reddit at Canonical Pod, where we regularly post threads for discussion. We'd love for you to join us. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod. That's Canonical Pod, one word. We'll be back next week with our third book, The Human Stain, by Philip Roth. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.